Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. Welcome to all of you, particularly the students that are here. This is part of our public policy mixtape podcast, where we talk about a range of public policy issues, and we are happy to have you and welcome you here. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Harold Holzer, the director of the Public Policy Institute, for his leadership, President Rabb as well for her support for this institute. I want to also thank the folks that work on our staff, Bianca, who's there, catching the candids, and Danny, who's our technical advisor and guru, who apparently I just found out knows how to do certain types of TV makeup. So thank you, Danny, for your support. Today, we are excited to have two incredible speakers and experts on the issue of sanitation. We thank you, Bianca, for putting this together and creating the title Talking Trash, which I used to only do on the basketball court, but now we can, back when I had knees and could play basketball, but now we wanted to talk about it from a serious public policy perspective. Post-COVID, how do we talk about sustainability in sanitation policy? And joining us today are two experts. I want to start with, to my immediate right, Dr. Lily Baum-Pollins. Pollins is correct? Pollins, who's an associate professor of urban policy and planning here at Hunter College. She researches the ways that cities resist the extraction, consumption, and pollution demanded by our current economic system. In her book, her recent book, Resisting Garbage, The Politics of Waste Management in American Cities, Dr. Pollins examines how cities can defy pressure toward disposability through waste management reform. I want to also introduce Gregory Anderson. Gregory is the Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Department of Sanitation. The Department of Sanitation is actually the nation's largest municipal sanitation department and is responsible for collecting more than 3 million tons of waste each year and keeping the city streets clean and free of snow, which is very important because we're coming up on that season. So in this role, he oversees policy development, planning, and analysis, and the implementation of department priorities. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon. And I kind of want to get into it with a very basic question. Gregory, what happens every day when we throw out our garbage? Where does it go? When the garbage trucks pick it up, where do they take it? Growing up in New York, I remember the Fresh Kills landfill. That's no longer in use, is that right? So what happens, what is the chain of events in a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for that introduction. First, I just want to say I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. And to talk about this important issue. It's one of the, I think, most fundamental services that New York City or any other municipality provides to its residents. So this is a really core, fundamental thing to talk about from the perspective of public policy. So what happens every day? Well, New Yorkers create 24 million pounds of trash and recyclables every single day. That's 12,000 tons, 24 million pounds, and that all goes right out on the street. So that's 6 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year, whether it's snowing or not. New Yorkers are making trash and recyclables, and it's our job to pick it up and make sure it goes somewhere safely, as sustainably as possible, and most importantly, reliably. So that's where the sanitation department comes from. It comes from the 19th century, when there was really a public health crisis in many cities, including New York, where trash was piling up. I mean, trash then looked very different than it does now. There were no disposable plastics and things like that, but there was a lot of, horse carcasses, manure.
Horse carcasses?
Yes.
Wow.
Tens of thousands of horse carcasses a day in the summer sometimes. And that's why sanitation, even today, is still headquartered in the same building as the health department. We fundamentally perform a public health service. But what do we do with that 24 million pounds? Well, we have an army of close to 10,000 employees, many of them frontline sanitation workers who actually manually collect most of that waste, put it in the back of a truck, and then those trucks go to what we call a transfer station. The trash from this neighborhood right here on the Upper East Side of Manhattan goes to the East 91st Street Marine Transfer Station, one of the most advanced facilities of its kind in the world. From there, the trash is dumped out of the truck, squeezed into a shipping container, a standard box, put on a barge. From there, it takes a somewhat convoluted trip to Staten Island, in fact, unloaded from the barge, put onto a train, and then from that rail yard in Staten Island will go to one of two places, either Chester, Pennsylvania, or Niagara Falls, New York, where it's turned into energy.
So we don't actually, so we ship it to other places for them to sort of deal with it after the fact.
That's correct.
And a couple of quick follow-ups. I'm still fascinated by the horse carcasses, by the way. You just don't think about that, but I think that's the point, right? That we have garbage, we just take what we have and throw it away and don't think about it after the fact, right? How has, you talked about staffing levels, how has the pandemic impacted that?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic, two things. One, really highlighted the essential nature of the work we do. And, I think New Yorkers really saw that and expressed that in their, notes of gratitude and thanks, along with other essential employees. And so that, I think that was the number one thing. The number two thing was, it was tremendously difficult, because the pandemic came with a real economic reckoning for our city. Clearly the city was focused on fighting the pandemic as best it could, and had to make really tremendous cuts to a lot of services. And I think sanitation in particular probably took the hardest of those cuts. So, we had fewer employees, and then with those fewer employees, we had, at some points up to 25% of our workforce out with COVID. So really dealing with the effects of COVID internally as well. And so, that made the city noticeably dirtier. And a year ago at this time, we had restored some of those services, but I think, the city was a very noticeably different place.
And just very quickly, does the Department of Sanitation, because we see different trucks out there for commercial garbage, so you don't pick up commercial garbage, or you don't? We don't. But does it go to the same place?
So there's sort of a parallel system, and it's one that for a long time was sort of the Wild West. A bunch of different companies providing service to every restaurant, retailer, office building, you name it. Any business out there, they pick up the trash. In the 90s, came under pretty intense scrutiny and regulation because of connections to organized crime. But today, still is really only regulated from that perspective of keeping organized crime out of the business and promoting honesty and integrity. So one of the things we're working on at Sanitation is a new regulatory structure and sort of comprehensive reform of that industry to rationalize the service provision and really deliver high quality services for New York City businesses.
Thank you. Now, Professor, Gregory used the word sustainable. Tell us about your research and how do we think about sustainability with so much daily trash? Because I imagine as a New Yorker, you don't want to see it, you don't want to touch it, you don't want to smell it, but there is a use for it. There's a use for it after the fact. I guess if it's processed in a certain way. But there are important points about sustainability that we should be paying attention to. So tell us about that and your work.
Also, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here in conversation. This is it's a really nice opportunity to talk to someone from DSNY and to just be in this beautiful space. And so thank you. And thank you all for coming. So the question of sustainability as it relates to garbage is kind of complicated. Most of the time in solid waste practice, we think about only what happens from the point, like from us to the curb to disposal. And we think about sustainability as what happens in that cycle. And there's no way to make that cycle sustainable, because fundamentally what's happening is all of the materials that we use every day go into the trash, and then either they go to a landfill where they're buried forever, more or less, or they go and get burned up for energy. And in terms of energy production, a lot of people argue that that's better than a landfill because at least you're getting some kind of benefit from it. But a lot of other people argue that there's no real way to make incineration perfectly clean. And the things that produce the most energy are plastics. Things that when you burn them also generate a lot of toxic emissions, some of which we can capture and some of which we can't. And then of course there's also the ash that remains, which has to then be landfilled. So you're still landfilling something, which is usually just a concentrated mass of heavy metals and toxic elements. And then you're capturing other elements in smokestacks, which then also have to be disposed usually by burial in a landfill. So even though you're capturing some energy from those materials, you can't really think of it as a cycle because those materials are not being filtered back into our processes of consumption. And in terms of efficiency, the energy production is, it doesn't compete with fossil fuel energy and certainly not with more other renewable forms of energy. So it kind of, it's sort of debate, reasonable people think different things about whether incineration is a good idea or not, but if we're thinking about sustainability more broadly, then we have to think not just about that side from consumer to disposal, but the entire system of extracting resources to consume things that are fundamentally disposable and then disposing of them. And that, Greg mentioned some of this long history from like the disposal of horse carcasses to largely the disposal of disposable packaging, which is the sort of mass bulk of our trash, that and organic materials. And so, all of that stuff is kind of new in our waste stream, and that is part of our lives, like through technological innovation and a lot of regulatory choices about how we were going to support economic growth. So I guess to put it really simply, if we want to think about sustainability in terms of waste, then we also have to think about consumption and the whole system that we've developed to provide mostly disposable things to sustain us.
Tell us about your research. You've sort of compared cities like Seattle and Boston, where you're from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What did you uncover in your research?
Well, there's a lot of things, but I guess most related to sort of the question of sustainability is kind of fundamentally one thing that I observed that's really different between Seattle and Boston, which are two kind of similar cities, kind of tech industry cities, similar size, coastal locations, with limited space for growth or landfills or anything like that. But they manage their waste really, really differently. And one of the kind of most fundamental things that I observed between them is that they actually think of them, their waste managers have defined their goals really differently. So in Boston, they sort of say, our job is to clean the streets, to keep trash out of the city, to remove it as quickly as possible. And they're not bad at it, like comparable to New York in a lot of ways, I think, in terms of just like the everyday experience. Although it's not as dense a city, so that creates really different set of conditions for actual waste collection. But in Seattle, they view their responsibility not just as removal of waste, but they think of themselves as responsible for changing the way people in Seattle consume. So not only do they have really advanced systems for composting and organics diversion and recycling, and really excellent and efficient waste collection processes, and they also very early kind of took over the commercial sector, which gave them more control over the whole urban environment. But they also think a lot about how to get people to think differently about processes of consumption. That's really hard. Cities don't control markets, right? They don't control where things come from. But they can regulate certain materials, right? They can say, we will not dispose of styrofoam. So you cannot use it in this city, right? And that's one thing they did really early. Plastic bags are another example.
Yeah, I was about to say plastic bags, right? Mm-hmm. That has changed our lives dramatically, to the point where I don't even really do a lot of impulse grocery shopping because I don't have a bag.
Change the consumption patterns. Right. There you go. Yeah.
And so what's interesting, as you talk about how cities view this, because during the pandemic, there was so much emphasis on trying to maintain the economic vitality of New York. And one of the ways that the prior mayor, and I know that the current mayor is wrestling with this in some ways, is what we did with restaurants and those enclosures on the streets and so on. I mean, how has that changed or challenged the day-to-day of your work, in part because we're seeing all of this. Look, I grew up in the city, so I've seen my share of rats in places, but there's a lot of conversation about that now. And as you talk about the historic sort of collaboration, if you will, or partnership between sanitation and health, like how do you view that in your current role?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think there were two major shifts that happened during the pandemic. One, people just did more things outside, and that was very challenging not only for sanitation but also for the Parks Department, for other agencies and our partners that maintain public space. Because at the same time we had fewer resources, there were more people that really relied on those resources to keep those spaces clean. So that was a huge challenge. Open restaurants is just one example of that. I think an incredible driver of economic rebirth after the pandemic, but also somewhere where, and this is something that Mayor Adams has been really focused on. Let's keep doing the things that work and acknowledge when the things that don't work don't. So we've been out there with the Department of Transportation taking down abandoned or derelict or non-compliant sheds, as we call them. I don't know if there's a better term, on a very aggressive basis for the last several months, and I think it's made a real difference. Restaurants that are doing the right thing, that are following the rules, that are keeping their spaces clean, we absolutely support that. Restaurants that aren't, at some point you have to make the decision that that's no longer good for the city. The one other thing that really changed during the pandemic that I like to mention is people also started doing way more things at home. So the amount of waste that we collected at sanitation was up in some places 10-15%, because you used to learn in school, you learned at home. You used to work at an office, you worked at home. You used to eat in a restaurant, you eat at home. So all of those changes really changed where the waste was. You also had some parts of the city, again, the Upper East Side, where a lot of people left during the pandemic. And so we had a lot less waste generation. So being able to adapt to those changes and move resources around as best we could was certainly something we had to deal with. And now that the city is, recovering from and moving into a post-pandemic world, something that we continue to do.
And I'm sorry, did you want to?
Can I just add
Yes,
something
of course,
to
of
that?
course.
I mean, one other thing that was a consequence of the pandemic was a kind of renewed emphasis on disposability as a public health measure, which actually measurably changed the waste stream in many places. Almost immediately, for instance, disposable masks started showing up on beaches because they so quickly went from the waste stream into waterways and then became kind of part of the environment of litter. And that's not necessarily because people throw them on the street, right? A lot of the litter that we kind of live with isn't actually from people dropping things on the sidewalk, although that occasionally happens, I admit it. But a lot of it comes from just things flying out of trucks, from falling out of garbage cans, even from flying away from landfills when they're not managed properly. So it so quickly enters the environment. Gloves, masks, all of that PPE was such a tremendous quantity of material that first of all, it was like a field day for the plastics industry, and you could see them mobilizing very quickly to kind of emphasize how plastic was saving lives and use that as kind of a marketing tool to roll back regulations at the municipal and state level. There's been some really interesting research out of Europe that kind of showed actually demonstrable changes to the municipal waste stream, like what was getting thrown away at the household level because of that new set of materials.
Let me actually follow up on that question, on that point, because we don't get to talk about it enough in public policy setting, academic public policy settings, which is the role of these major industries in influencing even something like sanitation and garbage, right? Like, so you talk about plastics. What is the role of the lobbyist in either fighting for or against sustainability in sanitation?
I mean, it's more or less everything.
Yeah.
And this is not my own research, but there are a few really excellent sociologists and historians who have kind of peeled back the history of recycling. And they have sort of accounted for the ways in which our municipal recycling systems were designed by industries like beer industries and Coca-Cola, all of the industries that kind of used to have bottles that you could refill, and then, in the late 1950s started to shift to single-use bottles. And immediately those bottles started showing up everywhere, littering roadsides. Like farmers in Vermont were just like, tearing their hair out because their cows kept stepping on glass bottles or like trying to eat aluminum cans. And it was such a problem that immediately there was a policy push to ban disposable bottles. And that seemed really straightforward. Like, if this is a new product and it's causing problems, let's just ban it. But there were a lot of industries that were not, that realized the kind of profit potential of a thing that you use once and then has to be remade and sold again. And they organized instantly. One state passed one law banning disposable bottles. It had a 3-year span. It was not renewed. No other state successfully was able to do anything of the sort. And as part of that lobbying, all these groups were formed, like Keep America Beautiful, which is a big one, which is all about like anti-littering and making individuals feel responsible for the kind of status or state of the environment. And as part of that, those industries also got together to ask cities, or to kind of ask everyone to create recycling programs for the products that they were producing. So our cities recycle, for the most part, glass, plastic, paper, and metals. And those are the most common packaging materials, right? We don't recycle textiles, right, which are actually a lot easier. They have a lot more beneficial uses. You can reuse them easily without remanufacturing them, which is a lot less energy intensive. But we don't do that because that was not part of this initial kind of lobbying project. And it was really effective. So then all of these cities kind of got on board and they were like, okay, we'll do it. There was a lot of popular support for it because it seemed like it was a new solution that would kind of be perfect. And then everyone could keep consuming these convenient new products without feeling bad about it. But really what it was doing was creating this massive profit opportunity, and all the costs were then placed on individuals and municipal governments. So now DSNY,
they're just shifting the costs.
they're shifting the costs. So now DSNY is doing that work and responsible for all of these materials that some other entities are profiting from kind of massively.
I wanted to ask you about that in a second, but let me just take a moment and say, if any of you have any questions, feel free to just raise your hand and chime in. We'd love to hear from you. I am especially attuned to my conversations with students around this issue of recycling and things like bottled water, because I tell stories about how growing up in the Bronx, when we used to play outside, we played outside. You get a rubber ball in a cardboard box and that's your day. And then when we got thirsty, we just drank water out of the hydrant. I know that seems like that's like unheard of now, but that's what we did, or a hose, if anybody had a garden hose. So so it's just interesting when we think about sort of bottled water. That was just not a thing that we had in those days. So I'd wanted to talk to you because and ask you about this because so tell us about sort of the recycling and other programs that are there, because I know there's some folks in my neighborhood that do composting, and I actually don't know that we know enough about that to even talk about it as a policy issue.
Yeah. So I think to the last point, one of the big focuses in policy today is trying to shift the burden back to industry, to manufacturers. Last year, the governor and the state Senate and Assembly were working on a proposal for an extended producer responsibility program, which would take the financial responsibility for recycling and put it back on the manufacturers of packaging. That bill didn't make it through last legislative session. We're optimistic we can work with all the parties again to try to move something ahead. As far as things like composting and textiles, those are places where the city has made a lot of efforts. Composting specifically, just last month we rolled out a curbside composting program to the entire borough of Queens. So any Queens resident, whether you live in an apartment building, a single-family home, anywhere in between, you can compost. We'll pick it up once a week.
What is that exactly? What does that mean?
So when we say curbside composting, what we mean is give us your yard waste, give us your food waste, and we'll figure out what to do with it. What we do with it at the end of the day is one of two things. Some of it gets composted, which is a a natural process that uses bacteria and enzymes to break down the organic matter in an aerobic environment, so in the presence of oxygen, into a nutrient-rich soil additive. So not dirt itself, but something that you can mix with fill material or topsoil to create a really great growing medium. And we use that in our parks, in our street trees. We sell it to commercial landscapers. So that's one of the two options. The other is anaerobic, so without the presence of oxygen, to again use bacteria to digest that organic waste into a renewable natural gas, so into methane that then can be cleaned up and used for heating homes, generating electricity, etc.
And is that something that anyone can do? Or are there is it more like pilot programs in certain communities?
Yeah, so as far as the collection service that we offer right now, it's primarily in Queens, and even though it's only in one borough, it's still the largest program in the country because Queens is much larger than Seattle and Boston put together. No offense. But it's also something that has a really strong legacy of being something that you can do hands-on. So you can compost at home if you have a yard or even a large balcony. If you are a member of a community garden, you can compost your food scraps and your yard waste. There you can see the process happen in front of you. It takes a bit of time, anywhere from 30 to 60 days, depending on what you're composting, but it's something that's very hands-on. And so that's one of the things that we've been focused on in creating a larger municipal run program, is making sure we keep those ties back to some of the grassroots elements that really drove composting since the 90s, 80s, even before, and keep those community aspects, the organizations that have been doing great work, but also expand it so that anyone can do it, whether you live in an apartment building or a home.
I'm glad you raised the point about community gardens, because there's one near where I live, and they do have a bin or what have you to compost. So perhaps outside of Queens, if you live near a community garden, wherever that is, maybe you see is it a bin?
Yeah.
I'm using the word
bin. And we have 220 of those sites where you can drop off your food waste and yard waste for composting, as well as we're rolling out a new program that we piloted last year in Astoria, Queens, for what we're calling smart bins. They're a bin that you can access with an app on your phone or with an RFID card. Drop off your food waste any time of the day, 24 hours a day. We'll come pick it up and compost it.
First time I saw this too, I had family in England, and this is what they did, and I was like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? We'll just throw it in the garbage." But no, this was very important to them, and I don't know if it's a national mandate of some kind in the UK, but this was something that she and her community they were very passionate about. So, I'd love to see something like that, be citywide if possible in that way. Yes, this question. Tell us your name, if you don't mind.
So my name's Abigail. I'm currently a junior at Hunter. And I had a question about the efficiency of recycling, because I've often heard that when it comes to recycling plastics, sometimes when people about the recycling, they put in plastics that can't be recycled. So what is sort of the process to that, and how people not being educated on recycling things sort of set back this efficiency, and also kind of tying into that, is there any way of that the sanitation is sort of thinking of making an educational program to teach New Yorkers how to recycle, and as you were talking about, Professor, about the importance of consuming and consuming less?
So 2 questions. So efficiency of recycling, and then education programs, and then we'll chime in as well.
Yeah, I think recycling is challenging because you want to maximize value, but also maximize convenience and ease for residents. So the approach that we've taken in New York City is investing a lot in back-end infrastructure to be able to handle things that maybe are more challenging to recycle or less recyclable, for the purpose of making it easier for residents to understand what goes in there. So we in our recycling program take all rigid plastics. So anything that's not sort of bendable and floppy goes in the recycling bin, and we'll sort it out and deal with it on the back end. In reality, there are maybe 2 or 3 plastics that are more recyclable than others. And what we want to do is maximize how much of those plastics we're capturing. For everything else, there may be smaller markets, there may be ways to downcycle it or reuse it for something else that's not true recycling but still has some value. And our recycling vendor has a profit-making interest in capturing all of that value that they can, and then anything that's left at the end of the day, any of the film plastic that gets in there or things like that ultimately gets thrown away. So we've really invested in processing to be able to make it easier for residents. Other places have taken a different approach. As far as educational campaigns, that's something that we've taken a lot of different approaches to over the years. Right now, we're really focused on sort of how everything ties back to cleanliness and the way that you perceive your environment. So, composting is a cleanliness issue, because what is the thing that the rats are looking for in the trash? They're looking for the food. Recycling is a cleanliness issue, because if you're properly, containing your recyclables and putting them out for collection, they're not going to end up being, loose litter on the street, or they're not going to end up in the sewer system. So everything that we're talking about right now is related to cleanliness, and that includes sustainability. That includes, all of these different programs. And I think what's interesting is, and it gets back to what I said earlier, it's all incredibly intersectional. Cleanliness is not just an issue of quality of life, it's an issue of public health, it's an issue of environmental justice. So it ties into a lot of other things that the city's really focused on, and that is the lens that we're using. We're hopeful we can do more in terms of public messaging. Obviously, that's something that it takes resources and funds, but we're certainly working in that direction right now.
I'll just add 2 things. One, New York City, you may have observed, still has a dual recycling stream, which means we collect the papers separately from the plastic, glass, and metals. A lot of other cities have opted for single stream because it's easier, right? And then, everyone, can you just put everything in the same bin and it goes away and you don't have to think about it. New York system is by far better for capturing valuable materials on the back end, because mixing together, particularly glass and paper, the glass shatters, it turns into sort of this glass dust which gets into the paper and cannot be removed. So paper is a really valuable product with secondary markets. It's ruined in a single stream recycling system, which ends up resulting in a lot more waste on the back end. So I hear people often complaining about New York's dual system and being like, what's with New York? Get with the program. It's actually really a beautiful thing. And I commend DSNY for sticking to their guns about that one. The other thing is that the issue of kind of consumer education around recycling is that cities have a role to play there, and they do an okay job, although a lot of sanitation systems, not just in New York, the communication piece is not the biggest part of their budget. It's not the expertise of the people who work there often. And that's something that a lot of cities have had to work really hard to build up over time. And they are overcoming, and they don't have to, it's they have to overcome this constant barrage of industry messaging, which is coming at us from everywhere all the time. And the example that I always use is every Amazon package that you get has a little recycling symbol on it, right? This little triangle. That does not mean it's recyclable. It's just identifying for you the number in the middle, the type of plastic that it is. But it's very misleading. And I learned from a student presentation a couple of years ago, actually, that the plastics industry intentionally stole that little triangle thing on purpose to make people believe that the products they were buying were recyclable. And they decided to use it as their indicator for plastic type, with the intention of making people feel better about buying things that the plastic industry knew were never really going to be recyclable. They knew the chemical composition, and they knew that it would probably not ever be economical or even physically possible to truly turn that plastic into a new plastic of the same quality. So cities then are charged with this impossible business, right? I mean, how much money does Amazon spend on marketing and all of, not just Coca-Cola and Nestle and all of these other multinational corporations, right? So that's really hard. And anything that a city is doing is swimming upstream against that kind of constant education that we're getting from the products all around us.
There's a good lesson in that student presentations, they matter.
We learn.
We learn too. We learn from you. We teach, but we also learn from you. So that's research. But I want to address something that we touched on earlier and that you raised again. If, for example, having these cloth bags at the supermarket can alter my behavior such that I don't go to the supermarket as often, or I make plans to go because I have to take those bags because I don't want to just. My issue is, well, not my issue, but my question is, if we're just now accumulating more cloth bags, have we created a different problem? Because there was a point where it seemed like, and I was talking to, because we're in a city and the sanitation gets funded and there's a city council, and so they're making legislation around things like this, right? So I asked a member of the council some years ago a question when we were moving from, we were trying to get rid of plastic and you saw more businesses use paper, and I said, weren't we trying to get away from paper because we were killing trees? And then we've moved to cloth, but is that now just going to create a different problem down the road?
I mean, I have thoughts. Do you have thoughts?
You can start this one.
Okay. I mean, first of all, a lot of the bags we use are not made of cloth. They're just also made of plastic. Sometimes it's recycled plastic, right? A lot of times it's probably not. So I don't know that we've really materially, what I always, when I'm evaluating a new program or a new thing, my question is always are we fundamentally altering material flows? Are we changing any of the systems that undergird our consumption, right? In this case, I don't think so. Probably just because it became a new product that people could market and create and are just becoming waste as well. So I don't think we've nailed it on the bag front. Also, those, cotton canvas, right? It takes a lot of water to grow cotton. And cotton is sometimes grown in places that are really water scarce. And so it's not, if it's not organic cotton, right, it's also huge. It's a monocrop requires a huge amount of pesticide application and synthetic fertilizer. So that's not it's not super great. Could we imagine a system where we're not constantly accumulating those bags, right? Every grocery delivery gives us new massive bags that they're not recyclable, they're not even practically reusable. It's just sort of we've just, I think you're right to point out that we've just kind of substituted one form of waste for another. And that means we didn't get it right, policy-wise, from my point of view. I'm interested in your thoughts, too.
Yeah, I think the plastic bag law in New York State was a very challenging one to get across the finish line in the first place. I worked on the initial city law, which was not a ban at all. It was a flat 5-cent fee on all bags, plastic, paper, what have you. There had been at the time proposals just to do a ban on plastic bags and have all the other bags not have a fee. I think what it really points to is you have to think through not only the first order consequences, but also second, third order consequences of these kinds of public policy decisions. It's something that I know in New Jersey right now, they're actually looking at changes to their bag law, which is even more stringent than New York State's, because of some of these second order consequences that are leading to people just piling up reusable bags and saying, I can't possibly use all of these. So I think those are things that as policymakers we have to keep in mind, and they're important lessons. I think it's also important to acknowledge that things may take 2, 3, 4 bites at the apple to really get it right. So that's something that I think we talk to legislators about all the time. Is it may have been challenging to get a law done. That doesn't mean that you can't change it in the future.
So let me sort of touch on that point too, because one of the things that I think might be important for students or anyone listening, that is how much you are a function of the money that you receive from the budget. Could you talk a little bit about sort of what the budget process is for the department, how you ask for money, how you determine your budgets? Because the other point that I would add is, and you mentioned this, you do different things. You pick up garbage, but you also plow our streets. Are you thinking about, are you talking to meteorologists and saying this is going to be a particularly difficult winter, so we need to put more money in for this? Like, talk about that process a little bit.
Sure. Well, what I will say is for anyone who's interested in working in city government, if you come in with an understanding of how the budget works, you're already 10 years ahead of everyone else that works there. So, I would encourage you, watch the budget hearings, read the testimony, read the budget documents. They're very long and dry, but that's a useful thing to have.
The magic happens.
Yeah. But no, I think, budgeting is a very complicated process because there are lots of inputs, lots of decision makers. In the city budget, the process generally starts in January for a fiscal year that starts in July. And there are sort of 3 separate financial plans that the city puts out on the way to getting to the final budget. So the first one is sort of the opening proposal from the administration. So the mayor and the budget director and all the commissioners and what have you, and that's based on forecasted revenues, and there's internal dialogue and conversations about what the priorities are. The second one, then there's a set of hearings and council response and feedback. The second one then is sort of taking into account some of that feedback, acknowledging other changes in priorities and things like that, and then ultimately, sometime before June 30th, the council has to vote and vote yes, and then the mayor has to execute the budget. So you have to sort of come together, and that's where, this year, for example, both the mayor and the council said cleanliness is absolutely one of our top 3 priorities. And so in that adopted budget, the mayor and council agreed to add $40 million in additional funding for things like litter basket service, cleaning up long neglected public spaces, doing a citywide study of waste containerization. So things that really reflected those priorities. Next year, we hope cleanliness is a priority again. Who knows? We'll see if something else comes up.
Okay. And a question for Professor, but maybe both of you as well. Is there, and I think you used the word before, is there intersectionality in sanitation, in sustainability? What are the sort of intersections of gender and race on a lot of these on a lot of these issues? I imagine that it's significant.
Yeah, I would say that it's significant. I would say, one thing that's a lot of the early activism around waste and facility siting, that came directly out of the civil rights movement and kind of cohered into the environmental justice movement in the 1980s. And so that was already a kind of intersectional movement as it became the environmental justice movement, because it was indigenous activists concerned about land protection and water protection. It was and questions of sovereignty, right? Because a lot of indigenous controlled land continues to be used for dumping, not just municipal waste, but industrial waste, even more for toxic industrial waste. And then there was the sort of main kind of thread of the civil rights movement, which even in the 1960s had some kind of parts of the movement were about organizing sanitation workers and thinking about workplace safety.
MLK was in Memphis.
That was
speaking to sanitation workers, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So those were coming together along with the environmental movement, which represented a really different demographic at that time, right? It was largely kind of middle-class white people who were thinking more about the preservation of wilderness and kind of, the preservation of natural spaces, but kind of intersected with these other movements. And it's been a rocky alliance. And I think now the kind of more traditional environmental movement is finally waking up and starting to understand what it has been told for the last 40 or 50 years from kind of frontline communities about the meaning of this, sort of the bigger picture of why this kind of activism is important. But I would say it still continues to be a very intersectional, the movement for environmental justice around waste in particular, but even bigger movements for regulating consumption, for extended producer responsibility, for things like that are impacting the upstream of municipal solid waste. Those are extremely intersectional, and I think we wouldn't we wouldn't have, we wouldn't even be anywhere near where we are in terms of our kind of awareness and discourse without that long history of activists teaching us about the consequences of all of this.
If I remember also, there was a major action in East Harlem, if I remember correctly, around garbage pickup. This was the activism among the Puerto Rican community in East Harlem. This is late 60s, I think, during the Lindsay administration, if I understood that correctly.
Wasn't that the origin of We Act?
That might very well have been. West, huh?
The Young Lords?
And the Young Lords were involved in that. One of my mentors was an advisor to the Young Lords, Arnie Segarra, and Felipe Luciano, who was a Young Lord, was who I've come to know over the years, was very active back then as well. And yes, We Act, which is West Harlem Environmental Action.
Yeah,
Peggy Shepard, who ran that, or I think still runs that. Very influential group in Upper Manhattan and the city, which is also interesting too, because there was as you talk about environmental justice, Upper Manhattan had been, I think, the biggest, had housed the most like bus depots in the city at one point, and there was a tremendous amount of action by We Act and other groups to reduce that significantly. So you're right. It's very closely tied to civil rights broadly. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes. Oh, we got a couple. We'll make them rapid fire. Why don't we start with you and come down? Yes.
Start with me.
Yes.
So this may have been a very isolated incident, but how true is it? So I take my plastics and my glass separate from paper, but I do see the truck take all of it and just put it in the same truck and just, take it away altogether, even with regular trash. And I was told, and I asked the workers, like, do you guys usually do this? Do you put everything together? And in a couple of times, they told me that everything goes to the same place. But mostly, I know they pick up garbage separate from the recyclables, but recyclables, there's no difference of the truck, or I don't know if they separate the bags when they get them to the facility, or how is it that they separate, all these materials?
Sure, so I think that one's for me. So as far as them taking trash and recyclables together, that's a big no-no. So anyone who in New York City who sees that happening should call 311 immediately, and we'll make sure that gets addressed with the proper authorities. But as far as recycling, we actually, in many parts of the city, not in Manhattan and denser parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx, but in most of the rest of the city, we actually do collect all the recycling in one truck. There's 2 separate compartments in the back, so they should be putting the paper on one side, the metal, glass, and plastic on the other. So keep an eye out for that, but if you see anything that looks shady, just call 311 and we'll take a look. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Come to think of it, I only see one gas truck at the gas station. So is it really different types of gas? I don't know. No, but you're absolutely right. Yeah. Call 311, and to be honest with you, 311 is an extraordinary tool to access the city. So absolutely do that. Well, again, quick questions, quick responses, because we have to. Yes.
So my question is about the share of the city compost that's composted anaerobically. First of all, if you have that on hand, how much of it goes through that process? And second of all, what makes that superior to incineration or landfill, where it's also going to be sort of either burned as the methane will be released and either flared or harnessed in some other way? What makes that a better process?
Yeah, so I think I don't have the share on me right now, and it changes, with as the programs that we're offering change, that changes. So we certainly try to compost as much as we can. There's very limited composting capacity regionally. So we have a site in Staten Island that we use. There are sites in upstate New York, Massachusetts, Long Island, but certainly a lot less capacity for that than there is for anaerobic digestion. One of the things that we're working with the Department of Environmental Protection on is expanding that anaerobic digestion capacity, because they have anaerobic digesters at their wastewater treatment plants that have unused capacity. So we're trying to use that to process some of the food waste. As far as, is that actually better than incineration or landfill? I think it certainly is, if only because, incinerators are very far away, and moving heavy, wet, organic waste to incinerators is a lot more resource intensive than using it here locally. I don't have statistics on like what's the conversion factor, maybe you do, of the various different uses. But I think certainly it's better to do AD or anaerobic digestion locally than incineration out of state.
Yes.
Okay, so really quick, I had a thought on your question about the education of waste disposal. I don't know if this is a Manhattan thing, because that's my borough, but I have received literature in the mail that was like a really easily digestible, like comprehensive guide on waste disposal, and it had tips on like recycling and composting and like different initiatives that were taking place throughout the city. So personally, I thought that was good to see, and it related to your question. But also, I'll try to make this as like compact as possible. But I wanted to ask about, you were talking about the pandemic and the kind of resurgence of more disposable products, and you were talking about that in regards to PPE, but I was wondering if that rollback of regulations also kind of opened the door for other disposable industries to have a similar resurgence. And then I just did have one, also in regards to the pandemic, and we were talking about Seattle and then banning like styrofoam materials and things like that. I was curious as to how that relates to like online orders, if that is something that has to happen at the federal level, or if states can do anything to enforce like regulations like that.
That's a great question. So to answer that quickly, Seattle they just banned styrofoam food takeout containers. So it was very narrow and it was very focused, and that was really effective at the city level. Just overnight, that material did not exist in the waste stream from that particular source. So you could still receive, styrofoam from other sources. It's not comprehensive. That would require a larger scale of regulation. On terms of the pandemic question, and maybe you have thoughts about this too, but that really did translate to other areas of the market. So very quickly we saw kind of like what turned out to be quite phony research, arguing that reusable bags were harboring the virus. That it was more likely to be, to have a longer life on, paper than plastic. That turned out not to be accurate at all, but there was a few kind of opinion pieces that circled around the industry literature and made their way to popular literature. And they were really effective because leaders were terrified in that moment, and anything that seemed like possibly was going to be useful. I don't fault the people making those decisions in that terrifying moment. They were really vulnerable to being kind of pushed. So many states rolled back their plastic bag bans or other kinds of bans or regulations, some temporarily, some permanently, and the industry was really savvy about, targeting, particular political environments where they thought they would be the most effective. And that was, like very strategic and kind of characteristic of the way that particular industry lobbying has worked over time. But to me, it just tells me that we need to be a lot more proactive about regulating.
I have to tell you, I think this question of has a pandemic era issue of us doing more shopping online in terms of behavior change, what has that done to recycling, to creation of more waste, because we don't go into stores and try things on and so anymore, right? How has that shifted our behavior, and what are the second and third sort of step ramifications as a result of that? It's fantastic. That is a research question that would be good for somebody's paper. And that is why we have these discussions, to generate these questions, to generate potential research, and to get some, hopefully some policy answers. We're just out of time, but I really want to thank Commissioner Anderson and Dr. Pollins for your time today. Thank you so much for a great discussion. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Is there any way how do we find you? Are you on the socials at all, or the interwebs?
I'm low profile on social media, but you can
follow
follow the sanitation department on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. We're actually very popular on TikTok right now. At NYC Sanitation.
Are there sanitation workers dancing by the trucks or something on TikTok? What is that?
We have a really wide range of approaches we take to that. Look forward to, or you should look for yourself and see what we have going on.
All right, Dr. Pollins, how do we find you?
I'm on Twitter, but maybe not forever.
Oh, right. Right. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Thank you. And eat up. We have plenty of food.